So last year when we met in San Francisco, the Advocacy and Issues group had been working on a statement, like kind of position piece or opinion piece about parental leave. And I was walking around the conference. I noticed quite a few residents, associate fellows, new fellows, and young fellows who had their babies in tow because the college had just updated its guidelines or rules for the college that you could come to clinical congress with your infant in arms. So as long as they were in a carrier, you could go into the lectures with your baby and breastfeed your baby if you needed to. However, in the several of the social media platforms I'm a part of, there were many women, residents, young fellows, medical students who said that they were too intimidated to come to the college because there weren't enough lactation services in the conference halls. And as you looked around the San Francisco Convention Center, you could see that, yes, there were minimal lactation kind of rooms available, no mama pods. It's sad when the airport has better lactation accommodations than a national conference with 13,000 participants. So my goal for this year was to improve the lactation and nursing resources for those attending the meetings. My goal would be to have us have a similar sponsorship and lactation rooms as the AAP and ACOG do. Their meetings are also at the same time every year. So all these pediatricians and OBs were posting the fancy pants pictures of their lactation rooms, showing that they had couches and fridges and plenty of places to plug their pumps in, and they could bring their kids into the exhibit halls. And we don't have that. So that was my goal. I did get Medela to agree to sponsor our room, a lactation room for McCormick in Chicago, which of course is now a moot point. And there also are more mama pods in McCormick in general. So it would have been a slightly easier lactation friendly conference this year. However, as you'll see on this slide, with the college being virtual for Clinical Congress, this is actually the most optimal lactation and nursing friendly conference I have ever attended, as I am home with my small child right now. But hopefully in the future for national meetings where ACS is expecting parents to likely bring their children, especially if they're still breastfeeding, we can improve lactation services, at least so that they're easier to find. In San Francisco, it was easier to find the coat room than the lactation room, which I find depressing. And then of course we had COVID. So next slide. Clearly a major issue this year for all of us, not just young fellows. So the RAS and YFA kind of banded together to send out a survey. You may have participated in it. Thank you very much if you did, about the life experiences of those who are still in training or just out of training, or quite frankly, 44 years old and have been in practice for quite some time. But we all, I think, felt the destruction of COVID and how it has changed our work environment to permanently in some cases. I mean, many people are now doing telemedicine that may never go back to not offering telemedicine that they weren't doing before. So that's certainly a component of our workplace that's totally different and totally updated with this pandemic. Next slide. So you'll see, I did not include the RAS info because we're not the RAS committee, but of the YFA, at least half of us, more than half, reported a decrease in compensation by up to 20% for the upcoming year, which is, of course, an added stressor to our already stressful lives. In addition, as you'll see on the next point, 86% felt increased stress due to the schools and childcare facilities being closed, which goes hand in hand with being able to get your job done. If you have children, if you don't have children, then hopefully that's not an issue for you. And then, of course, people, when they were surveyed, what would have been helpful for you, only a third of people even knew that ACS offers help and wellness resources. Many of us, most of us, said we did not have appropriate access to PPE. I would hope that's no longer the case. My hospital finally has a good stockpile. You can get a fresh new N95 any day you want it. But of course, there are still, I'm sure, hospitals and facilities in our country and other countries who do not have enough PPE to adequately care for these patients. And many actually reported feeling depressed and anxious, which is not surprising, given the work experience and the education experience that we were asking everyone to kind of turn off, and just kind of hover in this waiting period to see how this was all going to play out. Next slide. So the outcomes, as you can see, lack of resources, lack of PPE, and then actually female gender, which likely correlates directly with the school closures, daycare, et cetera. Not necessarily, I'm expounding on this data, but you can see that there's a lot of increased rate of depression and burnout with this pandemic. I'm sure we're not surprised to see this in writing. And then we'll go from here as to what can really help us continue this struggle and battle forward as we enter into flu season, and then have a double whammy, I'm sure, of illness to deal with in our hospital environments. I like how the bold was people who had enough PPE didn't get as burned out. Well, that's great, but again, you know, if our hospitals can't provide us with a safe environment to work, how can we feel safe working there? So that's the wrap up for advocacy and issues for this year, and we'll just continue to see how this plays out, I believe, for the next year.